Foreign students and shrines. I would like to write about a strange experience I had during Golden Week this year. I had an exchange student from San Diego named Susan, pseudonym, staying at my house. My mother was an English teacher before her marriage, and she liked to host foreign students. After I graduated from high school, we had a foreign student stay at our home every other year. Susan was able to communicate with me in Japanese, even though she spoke only a few words. She would always speak Japanese in my presence. Whenever we got into a topic that was difficult to communicate because she couldn't understand a word, I would use English with a dictionary in hand. He would get very angry and say, "I'm not learning anything." "It's not a good way to learn," she said. So, in front of Susan, I speak only Japanese. She was a good friend with whom I could easily talk about love and other topics because we were of the same age. During the Golden Week holiday, Susan and I decided to take a drive to the countryside for a couple of days and nights. Susan loved the nature of Japan. Our home is located in a rather congested urban area, and I wanted to give her a chance to breathe some fresh air after commuting to school by crowded train every day. The purpose of the drive was to see a castle in a neighboring prefecture. I am not a good driver, but thanks to the car navigation system, we didn't get lost. Thanks to the nice weather, I was driving along the prefectural roads in the countryside, feeling the pleasant breeze. At a small intersection, I put my left blinker up and hit the brake. I looked down the road and saw a large intersection, and realized that it was the large intersection where the navigation system had told me to turn. I slowed down and put my blinker up. As there was a car following closely behind me, I had no choice but to turn left at the intersection in front of me. The road we turned left onto was a single-track farm road. The road was very narrow, and because of the size of the one box I borrowed from my father, it was difficult to make a U-turn, and there were no side roads to turn around on, so I followed the road for a while. I had to go straight for quite a long time, and when I had no choice but to continue, before I knew it, I found myself in a residential area. Old wooden houses lined both sides of the street. It was more like a village than a residential area. None of the houses have parking space, and it is difficult to get a chance to turn around. There was a mountain in front of us, and we continued on to the end of the street without being able to turn around. At the end of the street was a parking lot that looked like it could hold about 20 cars. This was the parking lot of the shrine. In the parking lot, several streamers lined the street, each with a black on white sign reading "Academic Success" or "Pray for Longevity" written on it. Susan asked me, "What does it say?" I told her the meaning of academic success. Susan, who is interested in all things Japanese, got excited and wanted to see the inside of the shrine, so we decided to get out of the car and look around. I had not seen many shrines, but the view from the outside was unusual. I have not seen many shrines, but the view from the outside seemed unusual for a shrine. The shrine grounds are surrounded by a high white wall like a castle, and you cannot see inside at all. A torii gate stood at the end of the wall, through which we entered the shrine. I was surprised when I looked inside. It is so beautiful that I was surprised. And it is very spacious. Well-kept plants and trees, flat sandy ground. It looked like a sightseeing spot in Kyoto. There is a cool brook running through the grounds. On the other side of the stream, there is a mountain with dense trees. I found a young man who looked like a Shinto priest with a broom in the precincts of the shrine. She said, "It is unusual for a young woman to come here at this time of the year, not if it is the end of the year or the season before entrance exams. It's more than that," he said to me, "it might be the first time for an overseas visitor to come." He spoke to me. The man sold me a good luck charm for academic success and I gave it to Susan. I was tired from the long drive, so I decided to sit on a bench in the temple grounds with a glass of juice from the vending machine and take a short rest. It was the middle of a consecutive holiday weekend, but there seemed to be no visitors other than us, and it was very quiet. Susan, who loves nature and traditional Japanese architecture, is very excited." Then Susan pointed to the end of the creek and said, "What's that?" Susan pointed to the end of the creek and said, "What's that?" On the other side of the creek was a torii gate. I thought it was strange that there was another torii gate inside a shrine, but when I looked closer, I saw what looked like stone steps leading up into the mountain. Susan was curious, so we approached the torii gate together for a closer look and discovered that it was a small one, about the height of a woman's waist. Susan insisted on going through the small torii gate. However, even though we walked along the creek to the edge of the temple grounds to look for it, we couldn't find any bridge at all that would allow us to cross over to the other side of the river. The creek was only about 3 meters wide and ankle deep, so since the weather was so hot, I decided to take off my shoes and socks, lift up the hems, and enter the creek barefoot to cross over to the other side. We crossed over to the other side of the river, put our shoes back on, and Susan got down on all fours and walked through the small torii gate. I got down on all fours and walked through the torii gate, my jeans stained, and smiled at Susan. As I looked up the stone steps leading up the mountain behind the gate, I suddenly became curious about what lay beyond. Susan seemed to feel the same way, and we started to climb the stone steps without saying a word. The stone steps soon ended and became a normal mountain path. The sunlight was blocked by trees, and it felt very cool. As we continued onward and upward, we came to another small torii gate and the stone steps began again. Next to the torii gate was a stone monument with the name of the shrine written on it. The name was completely different from the name of the large shrine we had first entered. The ground was wet and we did not feel comfortable going under the shrine on all fours, so we went around the outside of the torii gate and went up the stone steps a little further. It was a pair of children. As I approached, I recognized 2 children singing something in small voices. At the same time, we could tell from their singing that they were not children at all, but little old women. They must have noticed us, but they did not stop singing at all. The song was a strange one, with unfamiliar words interspersed throughout, such as "Please let me live another 10 years, and the word "thank you" kept appearing over and over again. There is a small hall on the left side of the hill with stone steps, to which the old women are heading to join hands. They are wearing thick cardigans made of woolen yarn in this heat. I looked over the backs of the old women and clasped my hands together as I too faced the hall. Susan, following my movement, also joins her hands in prayer. The hall was filled with a large offering of vegetables such as eggplants, peppers, and cabbage. On the upper level was a sphere shaped like a soybean with a rickety surface. It was about 2 sizes smaller than a basketball. It seemed to be made of stone, shiny and reflected the light coming through the trees. When the song ended, the old women turned their heads in our direction. When I saw their faces, I was a little surprised. Their faces were bright red. It would be easier to understand if I say that their faces were vermilion. The old women wore strange makeup. They were applying some kind of lipstick from the area between their eyebrows, via the top of their eyebrows, through their chins, and circling their entire faces. At first I thought it was blood or something and was quite surprised. When I greeted them with a surprised hello, in a raised voice, the old women spoke to me with the same unfamiliar intonation as the goddesses I had just met. First they asked me how old I was. I cannot remember their words in detail now. "How old are you?" I answered, "I am 23 years old." I was told, "You are still too young to climb any more stone steps." I don't remember the exact words. I don't remember the details of the phrase, but the phrase "to get a divorce" is the only thing that remains in my mind. The old woman told us to go up the stone steps, which went straight up for a long distance from the hall, where we were, and at the end of the steps was a large shrine. At the end of the steps, there is a large shrine. In front of the shrine, I could see a figure, but it was too dark because of the dense trees. At that moment, Susan spoke for the first time in front of the old women. Pointing inside the hall, She pointed to a lumpy stone-like object enshrined there that looked like a soybean and asked, "What is this?" Then, the old woman let out a loud scream, "Gee! You're not Japanese. Batsuo Hozu. Get off now. Get off. Get off." He started yelling. Although Susan has blue eyes, her dark hair and small stature probably made the old woman unaware that she was an American until she uttered a few words of Japanese. When I looked at the large shrine above, I saw the figure I had just seen coming down toward me, probably because it heard the screams of the old women. It seemed to be moving in a hurry, but its legs were slow and it was coming down slowly. I became frightened, and I pulled Susan's hand and ran down the stone steps as quickly as I could. Susan's hands were very sweaty and cold. I never looked back and went through it on all fours as I entered the mountain. We walked down to the small torii gate that we had passed through on all fours when entering the mountain. We both hurriedly took off our shoes and began to cross the creek, when we noticed something unusual. The creek, which had been ankle-deep before, was now knee-deep. Knee-deep in the creek. When I managed to cross to the other bank, I looked back and saw Susan standing motionless in the middle of the creek. "Susan? Are you okay?" Susan, who never speaks English in front of me, started screaming in English. I am not good at English, so I could not understand what she was saying at all. After the screaming stopped and her mouth started to water, Susan collapsed into the river. At that moment, I felt a presence behind me. Behind me stood a man who looked like a young Shinto priest who had sold me the amulet. He entered the river, even though his clothes were wet, and supported Susan as he brought her to our bank. Susan was in such a state that her body had no strength at all and her breathing was labored. A man who appeared to be a Shinto priest and I carried Susan to the car, holding her in our arms. The man was concerned that he could not see us, even though our car was in the parking lot, so he was looking around. When I told him that the river was only as deep as my ankles at first, he was extremely surprised. When I told him about what we had seen at the top of the stone steps, his face turned blue. He then became angry that we had gone up the stone steps. When I tried to ask her about the old women in depth, the man's face turned even paler and he began to tremble. He continued, "You should go home soon and forget about today." I wanted to ask him more about what we had experienced, but the man's unusual response prevented me from asking any more questions. Susan was not feeling well, so I started the car. It was a little after noon when we left the parking lot of the shrine. We drove through a residential area to the prefectural road and headed back to our house. Susan then caught a cold and developed a high fever. She was unable to eat for several days and had to go to the hospital several times for intravenous drips. Susan has been alive and well since her return in August and we still continue to exchange emails. However, Susan does not seem to remember much about that day. She remembers drowning in the river at the shrine, though. That seems to be her only memory. Was I the only one daydreaming? Who were those old women? What was the invitation to the little shrine on the other side of the creek? I am curious, but I don't have the courage to go there again. Even now, I sometimes dream of climbing the stone steps. This concludes this story. Thank you for listening to the end.